The first thing I noticed about the Airbnb was how quiet everything was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy, unnatural kind that seemed to press in on me from every side. It was late afternoon when I arrived, and the small town where the house was located felt almost empty, like a place that time forgot. I'd booked the place on a whim, needing to get away from the noise and chaos of the city for a few days. The listing promised a cozy cabin retreat and showed pictures of a neat, two-story wooden house surrounded by trees. It looked perfect online, simple, clean, and remote. What I didn't realize was just how isolated remote really meant. The driveway was a rough gravel path that curved between dense stands of pine and fir trees. I had to drive slow because the gravel was loose and the tires kicked up dust that hung in the still air. When I finally pulled up to the house, I got out and looked around. The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows that made everything look darker than it really was. The house itself was old but well-maintained. The wood siding stained a deep brown, with a porch that wrapped around the front. There was a single porch light that flickered faintly, struggling to stay on. Inside, the house smelled like wood and something faintly musty. It had that old house feeling where the air feels a little thick and stale, like it hadn't been opened up properly in a while. The floors creaked under my feet, and the windows were slightly fogged, but the place was clean. I unpacked slowly, trying to settle in, but even as I moved around, I felt the weight of the silence. There were no sounds from neighbors, no distant traffic or birds chirping, nothing but the quiet hum of the house itself. I tried to distract myself by exploring the house. The kitchen was small but had everything I needed. A stove, a tiny fridge, some basic dishes and silverware neatly stacked in cabinets. The living room had a couch and a few chairs, and a TV mounted on the wall, though the remote didn't seem to work. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The windows in the bedrooms looked out onto the thick forest, but the glass was old and slightly warped, making everything outside look blurry. That night, after eating a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, I sat on the porch, hoping to soak up some fresh air. The sky was clear, and the stars were sharp and bright. The silence outside was total, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After a while, I went back inside, locked the doors, and tried to watch some TV, but it was just static. I ended up reading a book by flashlight in the living room, but I kept hearing small noises, creaks, thuds, the faintest scratching sound from upstairs. The scratching sound kept me awake longer than I wanted. It wasn't consistent. Sometimes it would stop for long minutes, then start again, light and soft like nails dragging across wood or maybe a branch scraping the side of the house. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling or the wind outside, even though there was no wind at all. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee in the tiny kitchen. The sun was still low, and the house was starting to warm up with the light. I opened a window in the living room to let in fresh air, and for a moment, the silence felt less heavy. I could hear faint sounds from the forest, the snap of a twig, a distant bird call. It felt like the place might come alive during the day. I decided to explore the area a bit. The house was perched on a slight hill, and behind it, the forest stretched for miles. There was a narrow trail that looked like it hadn't been used much, just a dirt path covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. I followed it for a while, trying to clear my head. The trees were tall and close together, and the air smelled fresh but damp. After walking about 15 minutes, I came to a small clearing with a stream running through it. The water was clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones. I stayed there for a while, watching the water and listening to the quiet splash of the stream. It felt peaceful, and for a moment, I thought maybe this trip would be just what I needed. On my way back, I noticed something strange. The trail I had taken didn't seem to match the map I had printed from the Airbnb listing. The map showed a small pond nearby, but I didn't see it anywhere. Instead, the trail looped back to the house through dense forest, and I realized I'd lost my sense of direction more than once. When I got back, I double-checked the house. All the doors were locked, the windows closed, but I still felt uneasy. The scratching noise was back, this time more persistent. It wasn't coming from the roof or outside, It sounded like it was inside the walls or maybe the ceiling. I tried to ignore it, but every time I sat down, it started again, slow and steady. That evening, I prepared dinner, but I was too distracted to enjoy it. The house felt colder than before, even with the heater running. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I kept glancing at the windows, feeling like something was watching me from the trees. I know it sounds crazy, but there was a feeling of being followed or stalked that I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I woke to a loud bang. It was sharp and sudden, like someone had slammed a heavy door upstairs. I froze for a moment, listening. The house was still except for the faint creaking of the floorboards. My heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably just the wind knocking something over, but the windows were closed tight. I grabbed my phone and tried to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal, no bars at all. I checked the router for the Wi-Fi, but the internet was dead. I felt completely cut off. I moved cautiously toward the stairs, the house groaning under my footsteps. The banging came again, this time softer, like something tapping on the wall. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. The scratching sound was louder here. It was coming from the bedroom at the end. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a bed, a dresser, and a small window. The scratching stopped as soon as I entered. I searched the room carefully. Nothing looked out of place, no sign of anything or anyone else. I even checked under the bed. The window was locked tight. I was about to leave when I noticed something on the floor near the closet. A small pile of wood shavings, like someone had been carving or scraping something. I pulled open the closet door, half expecting to find a raccoon or some kind of animal. But the closet was empty except for some old coats and a dusty box. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down, but the feeling of unease didn't leave me. I went back downstairs and locked all the doors again. I stayed up the rest of the night with a flashlight, staring out the windows, listening for any sound. The scratching didn't come back, but the silence was worse. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to stay longer. I packed up quickly and checked out. As I drove away, I looked back at the house through the rearview mirror. It looked normal in the daylight, just a quiet cabin in the woods. But I knew I'd never come back. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales that made the place scary. It was the total, suffocating silence, the feeling of being watched, the strange noises that didn't make sense. It was the kind of fear that crawls into your skin when you're all alone and cut off from the world. The house didn't have to be haunted for it to feel wrong. Sometimes just being so isolated, surrounded by endless trees and no other people, is enough. When I finally got back to the city, I couldn't stop thinking about that house. It was the kind of place where the mind starts playing tricks, where every creak and scratch makes you jump. But I also realized it taught me something. Fear doesn't always come from what you see or hear. Sometimes it's the silence, the emptiness, the unknown waiting just beyond the window. I don't regret going there. Even though it was one of the scariest experiences of my life, I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the quiet that's too deep, and to know when to walk away. The Airbnb was just a house in the woods, but for a few days it was a place that reminded me how real fear can be, without any ghosts or monsters, just the simple, terrifying feeling of being alone in a world that doesn't answer back. The day we arrived at the Victorian house, my partner and I were full of excitement. We'd found it online. A beautiful old home, all woodwork and stained glass windows, with a porch that wrapped around the front. The photos made it look charming, the kind of place that held stories in its walls. The listing said it was quiet, in a small town with a friendly neighborhood, perfect for a weekend getaway. We'd been working too hard, and this felt like the perfect chance to get away from the city's noise and stress. When we pulled up, the house looked even better than in the pictures. It was tall, with peeling paint that gave it character rather than neglect. Ivy crawled up one side, and a large oak tree stood proudly in the front yard, its branches casting shadows on the porch. The driveway was narrow, made of cracked concrete, and a rusty gate squeaked as we pushed it open. We parked the car and stepped onto the porch, the wooden floorboards creaking under our feet. The front door was painted dark green, with a brass handle that had dulled over time but still looked sturdy. The inside smelled of old wood and faintly of dust. The floor was covered in thick rugs, and the walls were lined with wallpaper in muted floral patterns, slightly faded and peeling at the edges. We noticed the high ceilings right away, with decorative molding and chandeliers that looked like they'd seen better days. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak from the wood, which we blamed on the old construction settling. We spent the first hour unpacking and exploring the rooms. The living room was large with a fireplace, though the hearth was cold and empty. There were bookshelves filled with dusty books and some old photographs framed on the walls, mostly of people from long ago, dressed in clothes that looked like they were from the early 1900s. The kitchen was small but functional, with a worn wooden table and mismatched chairs. The windows were old and thick, with slightly warped glass that made the light outside shimmer strangely. That first night, we slept in the master bedroom upstairs. The bed was a big four-poster with heavy curtains, and the room had its own bathroom with a clawfoot tub. We felt cozy at first, happy to be away from our usual routines. But then things started to feel off. It began with the doors. Not all of them, but a few, mostly the ones on the second floor. We'd hear creaks and soft thuds late at night. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the wood expanding or contracting with the temperature change. But then, a door would be slightly open in the morning, even though we'd closed every door tightly before bed. It wasn't just one door either. Sometimes the door to the guest bedroom was cracked open, sometimes the bathroom door downstairs, even the pantry. One night, I woke up because I heard footsteps. They were soft but deliberate, coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. My partner was asleep beside me, so I didn't want to wake them, but I sat up quietly and listened. The footsteps moved down the hall, pausing outside the guest room, then down the stairs. I heard nothing after that, just the usual creaks and groans. I told myself it was probably the old house settling, maybe an animal on the porch. The next day, I found scuff marks on the wooden floor near the staircase. They looked fresh, like something heavy had been dragged across the boards. The walls near the stairs had scratches too, long thin lines that hadn't been there the day before. I showed my partner, but they shrugged it off, saying it was probably from the previous renters or just natural wear and tear. Later, while cooking in the kitchen, I heard whispers. It was so faint at first that I thought it was the wind outside or maybe the sound of the trees brushing against the windows. But then it got clearer, a low murmur like someone talking just out of earshot. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely. The sound seemed to come from the hallway leading to the back of the house. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down the hall, checking every room. No one was there. The whispering stopped. That night was worse. We had both fallen asleep early, exhausted from the day's drive and unpacking. Around 2 a.m., I was startled awake by the sound of a door creaking open slowly. It was the guest bedroom door at the end of the hallway. I sat up and saw it swinging gently, as if pushed by a breeze. But all the windows were shut tight, and the house was still. I got out of bed and walked down the hall. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the air felt colder, even though the thermostat was set the same as it had been all day. I reached the guest bedroom and pushed the door closed. I checked the windows, shut the blinds, and even put a chair in front of the door to keep it from moving. Then I went back to bed, feeling uneasy but trying to ignore it. We tried to laugh it off the next morning, telling ourselves old houses have noises and drafts. But the feeling didn't leave. The atmosphere in the house was heavy and silent in a way that made it hard to relax. The furniture seemed too still, the shadows too dark. In the afternoon, I walked outside to stretch my legs and maybe talk to some neighbors. I noticed a few people working in their yards, and one older woman came out onto her porch as I passed. I asked about the house, just small talk really, hoping to learn about the neighborhood or any local tips. She hesitated, looking at the house with a strange expression. Then, quietly, she told me that a guest who had rented the house a few months before had died there under mysterious circumstances. The police had never fully explained it, but the guest was found in the living room one morning with no clear cause of death. No signs of struggle, no drugs or alcohol involved. Just gone. The house had been empty since. She didn't say much more, but I could tell it was something people didn't like to talk about. I thanked her and walked back to the house feeling a chill that wasn't from the spring air. That evening, the strange things got worse. The footsteps came again, louder this time, walking from the stairs into the hall, then to the kitchen, then back upstairs. Doors creaked open and closed on their own, sometimes suddenly, waking us up with sharp noises. We stayed together in the master bedroom, locking the door and even wedging a chair under the handle. But even then, we heard noises, whispers, faint knocking on the walls, and that dragging sound from the stairs. We started packing late that night. Neither of us spoke much. We moved quickly, trying to finish before dawn. The house felt alive with tension, like it was watching us. When we finally left, the early morning sky was just starting to brighten. We didn't look back at the Victorian home. We drove away in silence, both of us relieved to be gone. The next day, we contacted the Airbnb host to explain why we left early. The host apologized and said they had no idea about the previous guest's death until recently. They promised a full refund and said they would take the house off the rental market to investigate. We didn't return. The whole experience left a mark on me. I'm still not sure what caused the strange noises or why the doors moved on their own, but I know I never want to stay in that house again. Looking back, the house itself wasn't haunted by ghosts or anything supernatural. The strange sounds and movements were probably due to its age. Creaky wood, old pipes, and drafts sneaking through cracks. The whispers might have been the wind moving through broken shutters, or distant voices from the street mixing with echoes inside. But knowing a person died there, so suddenly and mysteriously, made every sound feel heavy with meaning. It was as if the house held on to that tension, and we were just passing through it for a while. Sometimes, when I'm in old houses or buildings, I think about that place, how silence can be louder than noise, how emptiness can feel like a presence. That weekend made me realize that old houses carry history not just in pictures or furniture, but in the very way they breathe and settle around us. I still get chills thinking about it, but I also understand now why people say some places just don't feel right. It wasn't ghosts or curses, just the weight of a sudden, unexplained death in a quiet house that held its secrets tight. And sometimes that's scarier than anything else. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a long stretch of stressful work and endless noise in the city, I wanted nothing more than a quiet retreat. I found a small cabin tucked away deep in the woods through an Airbnb listing. It was perfect, a rustic wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, far from any town or road. The photos showed a cozy interior with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and big windows looking out over the forest. No internet, no phone signal, just me and the quiet. I told myself I'd finally get a chance to rest and clear my head. When I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows between the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. The driveway was narrow, lined with fallen leaves, and the cabin sat just a short walk off the road. I pulled my bags inside, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and took a moment to breathe in the peacefulness. Everything looked exactly like the pictures. I unpacked slowly, put some food in the fridge, and started a fire in the fireplace. I was already feeling more relaxed. As the sun disappeared and night settled in, I noticed how quiet it was. No cars, no dogs barking, no distant voices. Just the sounds of the woods, leaves rustling, branches tapping against the cabin walls in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl. I set up my little reading lamp in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, and settled in for the evening. But then, around 10 p.m., I started to hear something that didn't belong to the woods. At first, it was faint, almost blending with the creaks and groans of the cabin itself. Footsteps, soft, slow footsteps crunching on the gravel path outside. I paused and listened. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and then there was a scratching sound, like claws or nails dragging along the wood. It didn't sound like an animal. I shivered but told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other critter. Maybe it was just the wind blowing sticks against the door. I didn't want to let fear ruin my trip, so I ignored it. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows again and tried to distract myself with my book. The scratching continued off and on for maybe an hour. Sometimes it was quiet, sometimes louder. The footsteps came and went. I told myself the cabin was old and made noises, that I was tired and just imagining things. Eventually, I fell asleep with the fire dying down. I woke a few times during the night, heart racing when I thought I heard the footsteps again. But when I looked out the window, no one was there, just dark trees and empty shadows. The next morning, I planned to make a big breakfast and maybe explore the small trail behind the cabin. I felt a little uneasy but brushed it off as nerves. Then, as I started moving around, I noticed things that didn't add up. The kitchen window was slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it before bed. The door to the bedroom was ajar, though I always closed it when I went to sleep. The food I had put in the fridge was moved, a carton of milk shifted to the side, some bread pulled halfway out of the bag. My coffee mug, which I always left on the counter, was now on the table. Most chilling of all, there was a note stuck on the fridge door, written in thick black marker. The words were simple but made my blood run cold. I was here. I stood frozen, staring at the note. The cabin felt different now. Not quiet, but heavy with something unseen. My mind raced. How could someone get inside? The cabin was supposed to be locked tight, and the host had told me no one else had keys. There was no nearby road to sneak in without me hearing, no neighbors to check on me. I spent the next hour walking through every room, checking every lock and window. Nothing was broken or forced open. Whoever had been inside didn't try to hide. They moved around freely and left that note as a message. It was personal, invasive, like someone wanted me to know they had been in my space, watching me. I wanted to call the host, but there was no cell signal. I looked around for any kind of landline, but the cabin had none. I thought about calling the police, but I was so far out and without a working phone, I had no way to reach them. The thought that someone could be nearby, maybe still watching, was terrifying. I packed quickly, grabbing everything I could and locking every door behind me. I didn't look back on the way out. The footsteps, the scratching, the note. None of it was the peaceful retreat I had imagined. I drove as fast as I could until I reached a spot with signal and called a friend to come pick me up. I left the cabin and the woods behind, feeling like I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. After I got home, I messaged the Airbnb host to tell them what happened. They insisted no one else had access to the cabin, but I knew what I had found wasn't a mistake or an accident. I changed my locks at home, double-checked my security cameras, and started sleeping with a knife on my nightstand. I still don't know who was in that cabin with me that night, or how they got in without breaking anything. But I do know I was not alone, and whatever it was wanted me to know, it had been there. I never went back, and I never rented a cabin in the woods again. The peaceful retreat I wanted turned into a nightmare I couldn't shake. And sometimes, even now, I think about the footsteps outside that door. I was really looking forward to this weekend. After weeks of stress at work, my partner and I decided to get away from the city and book a cozy Airbnb in the countryside. It looked perfect in the pictures. A small, rustic cabin nestled among the trees, with large windows and a warm, inviting living room. The host had great reviews, and the price was reasonable for the area. We wanted a quiet place to relax, cook simple meals, and just get away from it all. We arrived late Friday afternoon after a long drive. The sun was already low, casting an orange glow through the pine trees as we pulled up. The cabin sat back from the road, down a narrow gravel driveway that crunched under the tires. There was a small porch with a couple of rocking chairs and a grill off to the side. The air smelled fresh and clean, with hints of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. Inside, the place was exactly like the pictures. Clean, warm, and well kept. There was a little kitchen with a stove, fridge, and some basic supplies. The living room had a small couch and a wood-burning stove that looked ready for a fire. Upstairs was a loft bedroom with a big bed and soft blankets. We unpacked quickly, then went out to explore the small property, which had a few walking paths through the woods behind the cabin. That first night, everything felt peaceful. We made dinner, drank some wine, and sat on the porch watching the stars come out. It was the kind of quiet that settles into your bones and makes you forget about all the noise and stress of everyday life. We slept well in the soft bed, waking up to birdsong and sunlight streaming through the windows. The next day was even better. We made pancakes in the morning, then took a long walk down the trail behind the cabin. The woods were thick but quiet, except for the occasional rustle of squirrels and the call of a distant hawk. We found a small creek and sat on the rocks, just listening to the water run. It felt like we were the only people in the world. Back at the cabin, we spent the afternoon reading and napping. It was one of those days where time seems to slow down and nothing feels urgent. We cooked dinner again and stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing. It was during that second night that I first noticed the blinking light. We were getting ready for bed, brushing our teeth and changing into pajamas. I caught a quick flash of red from the smoke detector mounted on the ceiling near the bedroom door. It was faint but definitely there, an almost rhythmic blink every few seconds. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed it was just a battery indicator or a regular test light. Smoke detectors often blink red when the batteries are low or when they're in test mode, but something about the blinking felt off. It wasn't the slow, steady blink I was used to. It was quicker and more mechanical. Curiosity got the better of me. After we went to bed and turned off the lights, I took out my phone and used the flashlight to get a better look. The smoke detector was an older model but seemed intact. When I moved closer, I noticed the blinking light wasn't coming from the smoke detector's normal LED. Instead, it was from a tiny hole near the edge of the unit. I squinted. It looked like a small lens. I froze for a second. Could it be a camera? I hesitated but then carefully reached up and removed the smoke detector from the ceiling. It came off easily, and when I held it in my hand, I realized the front panel was a little different from a standard smoke detector. The lens was definitely there, concealed behind a tiny, pinhole-sized black circle. My heart started pounding. Someone had hidden a camera inside the smoke detector. I felt a wave of shock and anger. Who would do this? How long had it been there? Had we been recorded the entire time? I showed my partner immediately. They looked just as disturbed as I felt. We went through the cabin, checking for any other suspicious devices or signs of tampering, but didn't find anything else. I took pictures of the camera, the smoke detector, and the spot where it had been mounted. Then I wrote a detailed message to the host on the Airbnb app, explaining what we'd found and demanding an explanation. I also contacted Airbnb support right away, reporting the hidden camera and requesting a full investigation. The host responded quickly, apologizing and saying they had no idea about the camera. They claimed it must have been installed by a previous guest or contractor and promised to remove it immediately. Airbnb took our report seriously and assured us they would review the listing and take appropriate action. But even with the host's apology and Airbnb's response, the damage was done. The feeling of violation stuck with me. The idea that someone had secretly watched us in what was supposed to be a private space was terrifying. Every time I thought about it, I felt exposed and unsafe. We cut our weekend short and left the cabin the next morning, both of us feeling shaken and unable to relax anymore. The quiet and calm we came for were completely gone. After returning home, I kept replaying everything in my mind. How the camera was so cleverly hidden, how I only noticed it because of the blinking light, how easily someone could have invaded our privacy. I wondered if this was more common than people realized. How many other people had stayed in that cabin without knowing? It took me weeks to stop feeling paranoid in my own home. Every new noise or blinking light made me check for cameras. I even bought a small camera detector to scan rental places I stayed in afterward. Eventually, Airbnb removed the listing and banned the host from their platform after their investigation confirmed the camera's presence and failure to disclose it. But for me, the violation stayed. No apology or refund could undo the sense of being watched and the loss of trust. Looking back, the experience was a hard reminder that even places that seem safe and welcoming can hide dangers. It's made me far more cautious about where I stay and what I look for, and I never ignore blinking lights on smoke detectors anymore. I had been planning this trip for months. It was supposed to be a relaxing break from work, a chance to explore a new city I'd never been to before. I booked my Airbnb early, almost 6 months ahead, to make sure I got the perfect spot. It was a small, cozy apartment right in the heart of downtown. The pictures looked great, the reviews were good, and the price was reasonable for the area. I had arranged everything around this booking: flights, transport, even some events I wanted to attend near the place. I felt confident everything would go smoothly. Then, a few days before my arrival, I got the email that changed everything. The host canceled my reservation. No explanation, no apology. Just a simple notification that my booking was no longer valid. I stared at my phone in disbelief. How could this happen? I had been so careful so early. I checked the date again and again, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. But no, it was clear. The host had canceled. Panic started to set in immediately. The city I was going to visit was known to be busy, especially this time of year. Hotels were mostly booked solid, and prices were already high because of a convention happening downtown. I opened the Airbnb app, searching desperately for another place. But the listings I found were either way out of my budget or already taken. I felt my heart race as I realized how limited my options were. I spent hours scrolling through the app, refreshing the page, hoping for something to open up. Finally, a small room popped up. Barely a room, really just a tiny bed in a shared apartment. The price was 3 times what I had paid for the original place. I hesitated but knew I didn't have much choice. I booked it quickly, almost choking on the price. I kept telling myself it was better than nothing. But deep down, I knew this was going to change everything about my trip. The day I arrived, I was exhausted from the flight and all the stress leading up to this moment. When I finally reached the new place, it was nothing like the photos. The building looked old and worn down, with flickering lights in the hallway. The apartment itself was cramped, cluttered, and smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something musty I couldn't quite place. The bed was small, the linens threadbare, and the walls paper-thin. I could hear every creak and cough from the other rooms. I tried to push aside the disappointment and told myself it was just one night. But the nights stretched on and the problems grew worse. The heating barely worked, leaving the room cold and uncomfortable. The bathroom was shared with other tenants, who seemed to come and go at all hours, making noise and sometimes leaving a mess. The Wi-Fi was unreliable, dropping out just when I needed it most. I had to constantly recharge my phone and laptop in the shared kitchen area, which was often crowded and noisy. Every day, I felt more stressed and frustrated. My plans were falling apart because of the unexpected costs and discomfort. I had to cancel some events because I was too tired or the transportation time from the apartment was longer than I expected. I felt isolated in a strange city, stuck in a place I never wanted to be. To make matters worse, the host of this second Airbnb was hard to reach. Messages took hours or sometimes days to get a reply. When I did get a response, it was often vague or unhelpful. I asked for basic things like extra blankets or a cleaner bathroom, but nothing really changed. I started to feel trapped. I spent the last few days counting down the hours until I could leave. The city itself was beautiful, with vibrant streets and interesting places to visit, but I couldn't enjoy it because I was always worried about where I would sleep or how much more money this trip was costing me. What was supposed to be a fun escape had turned into a stressful nightmare. On the final day, as I packed my bags, I thought about everything that had happened. The canceled booking, the frantic search for a new place, the uncomfortable nights, and the frustration of losing money and time. I realized how easily plans can fall apart and how much of a gamble it is to rely on these online services, especially when things go wrong at the last minute. Even though the trip didn't go as planned, I was glad to be leaving. I had learned a hard lesson about always having a backup plan, about not putting all my trust in a single booking, and about how unpredictable travel can be. I promised myself to always book refundable options in the future or have a list of alternative places ready just in case. The trip ended with me catching a taxi to the airport, exhausted but relieved. I was ready to go home, to a place where I could sleep peacefully without worry. This experience didn't ruin my love for travel, but it reminded me that no matter how carefully you plan, Sometimes things just don't go your way, and the best you can do is adapt and keep moving forward. I arrived in the city late in the afternoon, tired from a long train ride and looking forward to the quiet week I had planned. The Airbnb apartment I had booked was supposed to be a cozy, affordable spot right in the heart of downtown. The listing had promised clean, modern space, close to restaurants and shops, with plenty of natural light and all the basic comforts I'd need for my stay. The photos showed bright rooms with white walls, a tidy kitchen, and a small balcony with a view of the street below. Everything looked perfect online, but as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The door creaked open on rusty hinges, and the smell hit me first. It was a thick, wet stench, like something old and rotten mixed with damp dirt. I stood in the narrow hallway for a moment, trying to understand what it was, but it only got worse the deeper I went. The light bulbs flickered weakly, and the air felt heavy and thick, making it hard to breathe. The walls, which should have been white and clean, were covered in dark patches. I soon realized it was black mold, thick, patchy, and spreading all over the corners of the ceiling and along the baseboards. The smell must have been coming from the mold. I had heard about black mold before and knew it could be dangerous. The place looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months, maybe years. I stepped cautiously into the living room. The floor was sticky, and the old carpet was stained with dark spots I didn't want to look at too closely. Near the windows, I noticed the curtains were torn and yellowed, hanging limply with dust and grime covering the rods. The windows themselves were filthy, and outside, the view was just a wall of brick from the building across the alley. Nothing like the bright, open scene the photos had shown. Then I saw them, cockroaches. At first, just one or two scurried across the floor near the kitchen doorway. But then I noticed more. They crawled over the counters, the sink, even the bathroom sink and toilet seat. The kitchen looked like it had been ignored for a long time. The sink was clogged and filled with dirty water and leftover scraps of food. The fridge was open, its door hanging loose, and inside, the shelves were broken and covered with a thick layer of grime. I looked around for the garbage bin and found it overflowing with old food wrappers and moldy leftovers. The smell came from there too, a rotten, sour smell that made my stomach turn. There was no way anyone had lived here recently and kept it this dirty without noticing. Whoever had been responsible for cleaning this place was either cruel or just didn't care. The bathroom was the worst. The shower curtain was yellowed with age and mildew, the tiles covered with black mold creeping up the grout lines like veins. The toilet had stains, and the floor was sticky with an unknown liquid. The mirror was cracked, and the small bathroom fan was broken, leaving the whole room feeling damp and suffocating. I pulled out my phone and looked back at the photos on the Airbnb app. The pictures online were bright and clean. They didn't show any mold or cockroaches. The kitchen looked spotless, the bathroom fresh and white. The listing had clearly been doctored to hide the true condition of the apartment. I tried to remain calm. I messaged the host immediately, explaining the situation and asking for a refund. I made it clear that I could not stay in such a filthy and unhealthy environment. But no matter how many messages I sent, I got no real reply. A few automated responses, then silence. I checked for other places to stay nearby, but everything was fully booked or far too expensive at the last minute. It was late and I had nowhere else to go. The city was unfamiliar to me, and I didn't want to end up wandering the streets with my bags. I was stuck. I told myself I'd just have to tough it out for one night and find a way to leave first thing in the morning. But the thought of sleeping in that place made me feel sick. I took out my bag and tried to unpack, but I was too distracted by the cockroaches crawling on the counter and the constant, unbearable smell. I looked for clean spots, places I could sit or lie down without touching the floor or walls, but there were none. Even the couch was covered in stains and looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I didn't want to sit there, knowing it was probably crawling with insects too. I found a blanket in one of the drawers, but it smelled musty and damp. I considered putting it on the bed just to have some barrier between me and the sheets, but I was afraid of what might be hiding in the fabric. I didn't know if it had been washed in months or years. The bed itself looked worse than the couch. The mattress had stains all over and smelled like mold and sweat. I tried to clean a small spot on the floor with some paper towels, but they came up black and soggy. The water I found in the kitchen sink was dirty and cloudy. I didn't want to risk drinking or washing with it. I had brought a bottle of water with me, so at least I could stay hydrated. The cockroaches didn't stop moving. They crawled over the counters, the floor, the sink, the toilet. I saw one large one disappear behind the refrigerator, and another one climb the wall near the bathroom. Felt like they were everywhere. I kept swatting them away, but they seemed endless. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting on my suitcase in the corner of the room, too nervous and uncomfortable to rest. Every small noise made me jump. The creaking of the pipes, the faint hum of the city outside, the soft scuttling of the cockroaches. The air was so thick with mold spores and the smell of rot that I had to keep the windows slightly open despite the noise outside. My skin itched constantly, and I could feel my throat getting sore from breathing in that foul air. I was scared I might get sick from just being in there. I thought about calling someone for help or finding a hotel, but the few places that had availability were miles away and out of my budget. Morning came slowly, bringing a faint gray light through the grimy windows. The cockroaches had settled down a little, but the mold and dirt were still there, unchanged. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to touch anything more than necessary. I left a detailed review on the Airbnb app, sharing every detail about the mold, the cockroaches, the smell, the dirt, and the photos being fake. I warned other travelers not to book the place. Then I found a cheap hostel nearby and moved there, grateful for clean sheets and a hot shower. Looking back, it was one of the worst nights I've ever spent in any city. The experience taught me to always read reviews carefully, ask for recent photos, and never ignore the gut feeling that something isn't right. That apartment was a nightmare, but at least I got out of there without getting seriously sick or hurt, and that made all the difference. We had been looking forward to this family trip for months. After a year full of work and school, finally getting away for a full week felt like a dream. We found a big house through Airbnb. It was exactly what we wanted. Lots of space for everyone, a large kitchen, a huge living room with a fireplace, and a big yard. The pictures showed it was a quiet, beautiful place on the edge of a small town, surrounded by woods but still close enough to a grocery store and gas stations. The host assured us it was a private rental. No one else was supposed to be there. We planned the trip carefully. I double-checked the address, the arrival instructions, and the parking situation. The house was about a 4-hour drive from where we lived, so we left early in the morning, hoping to get there by afternoon, unpack, and start relaxing. But the traffic was worse than expected. A few accidents slowed us down, and a detour added more time. By the time we reached the town, it was already dusk. We drove up the long gravel driveway under tall pine trees, the branches making shadows in the car headlights. The house looked bigger and more welcoming in real life than in the photos. The porch light was on, and I felt a small flicker of relief. We parked, grabbed our bags, and headed inside. The air smelled like wood and something faintly like old carpet. The floorboards creaked as we walked through the hall. We were all tired, me, my wife, and the 2 kids, so I didn't want to waste time unpacking. I opened the big front door wide and started carrying in bags. The kids dropped their backpacks in the corner and looked around with wide eyes. The walls were painted a warm beige, the furniture old but sturdy, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains that blocked out the night. We set down our things in the living room. My wife pulled out some snacks, and the kids grabbed some juice boxes. I went over to the kitchen to check the fridge and cupboards. It was stocked with basic items: milk, eggs, some bread, a few cans of soup. There was a note from the host on the counter, saying to make ourselves at home and a reminder about the checkout time. As I was putting groceries away, I heard a faint noise from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps or maybe someone shifting in a bed. I froze. We were supposed to have the whole house to ourselves. I called out, but no one answered. The kids looked up, their faces suddenly a little scared. My wife came into the kitchen, asking what was wrong. I told her I heard something. She shrugged, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal or the house settling, she said. But the sound came again, louder this time. A soft creak followed by a rustle, like sheets being moved. I told her I was going to check it out. I took a flashlight from the drawer and headed toward the stairs. The old wooden steps groaned under my weight. I tried to keep my voice steady as I called out again, but there was no reply. At the top, the hallway stretched out with doors on each side. The light from the flashlight bounced off the peeling wallpaper and the slightly warped floor. I reached the last bedroom door on the right and noticed it was cracked open just a little. My heart was pounding. I pushed the door slowly. Inside, a man was lying on one of the beds, wide awake and staring at me. He was older, maybe in his 50s, wearing a wrinkled shirt and jeans. The room smelled musty, like it hadn't been cleaned in a while. He looked calm, almost bored. I stepped back, shocked. I asked him what he was doing there. He said the host had told him it was okay for him to stay. I didn't believe it. I asked if he knew the family who booked the place, and he shook his head. I hurried downstairs and told my wife and kids to pack up immediately. I called the host, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, but no answer. We grabbed our bags and left as fast as we could, locking the door behind us. We didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I reported what happened to Airbnb and the local police. The police said the man had been caught before trying to stay in rental homes without permission, sometimes pretending he was allowed. The host apparently didn't tell us about him, maybe to avoid losing bookings. We never went back to that house. We canceled the rest of our trip and rented a hotel instead. Every time I think about that night, I still feel the chill of knowing someone was inside the house, uninvited, watching us without us realizing it.